Welcome to Mystery Bible. My name is Ken Primus. I am your host. We are looking at the life of Moses. We actually saw some interesting stuff last week. We are going to continue. This time, what I'm going to do is look at the Bible first. Then we are going to go and look at the other sources that we've been looking at, the legend of the Jews. We have been looking at Josephus, and we also have been looking at the book of Yasher. So we are going to circle back. As I mentioned to you guys, we are going to be taking the Bible as our foundation. And so we're going to circle back to the Bible on in chapter 2 with Moses when he runs away, because we started looking at that in the book of Yasher last week, and we saw some of it in Legend of the Jews and so forth. So we want to gather from all of these sources and continue our conversation, if you will, so that we can get a better picture as to what was happening in this young man's life. Remember, at this time he was 18 years old. He had led the army of Pharaoh. We know that he had victory. After the victory, we know that they were trying to kill him. We know that Balaam and his son left after he became victorious because he knew that Moses was trying to kill him. And so we are going to get a chance to see these guys again. And his family plays a great deal of a great part, if you will, within the Exodus itself, because we will get a chance to see two of his sons. They keep mentioning these two sons, but later on we'll see their name, because once you recognize their name, you will understand what I'm talking about. And we know that their father was one of the magicians in the courts of Pharaoh. And so with that in mind, let's take a look at Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 and to 25. And we're going to look, this is entitled Moses Runs Away. And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went unto his brethren, and he looked at their burden, and he spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brothers. He looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there were no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And so we saw what drove him. Remember, we looked at this hatred that was building up within Moses at the time, and as a result, this hatred needed to be expressed somehow. And this expression came because he started to develop his hatred for Balaam, if you guys remember. And when Balaam fled, that hatred was still in him, and then it needed because it was already deposited in our heart, and the Bible says that from the heart we act, we confess, we make decisions and so forth. And he had already put this hatred within his heart, and so it was just an opportune time. Something needed to happen in order for that hatred to manifest, and it manifested with this situation with the Egyptians, and he killed him, and he hid his body in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, two men of the Hebrew strove together, and he said to him that did the wrong, wherefore smitest thou your brother? Why did you hit your brother? And he said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian? And Moses feared, and he surely said that this thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. So we see, according to the Bible, he goes straight to Midian. And the other sources will give us some additional information that not really. He made a couple of pit stops, if you will. Now the priests of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the trough and to water their father's flock. And the shepherd came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. And when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "How is it that you came back so soon? How did you guys come back so soon today? Usually take them longer." And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hands of the shepherds and also drew water enough for us and watered our flock." And so we see that he was still in his attire because he had left, which is from this source. Okay, we're looking at from this source. He, according to them, it says the Egyptian delivered us. So from the source of the Bible, he went straight to Midian. He was dressed, and they recognized him as a Hebrew, not a Hebrew, as an Egyptian. And he said unto his daughters, "And where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." And when Moses was content to dwell with the man, he gave Moses Zipporah his daughter, and she bare him a son, and he called his name Gershon. For he said, "I have been a stranger in a strange land." And it came to pass in the proceed of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of bondage. And they cried, and their cry came up unto God, and by reason of the bondage. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. So we know then that, I have said this to you guys before. See, early in the scripture, it tells us that in verse 14, and he said, the people said to him, "Who made you prince and judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me?" And so Moses run. And so we see in verse 23, and it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. So this king that was putting the burden on them, he died. And the children of Israel were sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried, they began to cry. And so now I've said this many times that many of us have to get to the end of our rope in order before we can see the blessing in our life. And many times we know, and I'll take an example of this from the Bible. There's this woman with the issue of blood, and she had money. She's a well-to-do woman, if you will. And she was sick. She had some kind of issue with her body, and female issue, because it was it stated that in the Bible. And so she spends her money, and she was fine with the physicians at the time. She was rich. She had her money, and she wasn't. I'm sure Jesus was around there, and she wasn't really paying attention to Jesus Christ because, she had money, and that was not where her faith was. And so she had to come to the end of her rope, and the end of her rope for her looked like she was broke, and she was still dying. And then it was at that space that she was ready to hear the word of God. And so she heard that Jesus Christ was a healer. And the Bible says that faith comes by hearing. So when she heard, faith was present, and she began to move forward to get what she wanted. She made her confession when faith came. And we see that these folks are just the same. When it gets hard and they've done all they can, we've exhausted our natural way of doing things. And when we see that there's no other way that we can get what we want, that's when we start crying to God, "Help me, God," and "Help me, God." And people will start getting religious around that time because they're desperate. So we see then that according to this particular reading, that Moses went directly to Midian, because the daughter said that there is an Egyptian that helped us. Okay, so let's take a look now, and we're going to go and look at um, the, let's look at, I think, Josephus. Let's go to the historian and see what he has to say concerning this particular situation, the same thing that happened in, in these other sources, if you will. So the last time we looked at, we know that as I mentioned, Moses did his thing. He killed those folks, as I mentioned earlier, and Balaam took off, and he just uh, dispatched his people, and he is about to, he's on the run. So now let's take a look at it from uh, this man, as he's Moses from the historian. Now the Egyptians, after they had preserved by Moses, entertained a hatred to him and were very eager in compassing their design against him, and suspecting that he would take occasion for a good success to raise a sedition and bring innovation into Egypt, and told the king he ought to slay him. The king also had some intentions to slay him for the same purpose, and this as well out as envy at his glorious expedition at the head of his army, as out of fear of being brought low by him and being instigated by a sacred scribe, he was ready to undertake to kill Moses. But when he had learned beforehand what plot he had against him, he went out privately, and because the public road were watched, he took his flight through the desert, and where his enemies could not suspect he would travel, and though he was destitute for food, he went on and despised the difficulty courageously. And when he came to the city of Midian, which he lay upon the Red Sea, and was so demonstrated for one of Abraham's son by Keturah. And we know that Abraham's son, and we know that Ishmael, the Arab nation, and all of claim Abraham as father, which is so. We know that Keturah's children also are part of that, and we know that according to the scriptures, Ishmael's son, those are considered, the Bible calls them, or the book of Yasher calls them, the wild ones, are the ones that will always instigate trouble, a restless one, instigator. That's what it calls them. And we see that in many cases, that's who they are. It calls them the wild ones, and that they would start trouble. It tells us in the book of Yasher. So we see then that Abraham is basically running into family just all over the place, and that's why I tell you guys, we're all related. It doesn't matter. And so he sat down at this well. So we see that this, according to the historian, he went straight to Midian, and he rested himself there after his laborious journey. And the affliction he had been in, it was not far from the city, and the time of the day was noontime, where he had an occasion offered by the custom of the country by doing what recommended his virtue and afforded him an opportunity of besetting his circumstances. So they're saying here that there was, because of the time of the day that he came, there was an opportunity that will be given to him to change his circumstances, if you will. And here is the opportunity. For that country having but little water, the shepherds used to seize on the well before others came, lest their flock should want water, and lest it should be spent by others before they came. They were now come therefore to this well 7 sisters that were virgin, the daughters of Ragul, and a priest, and one thought worthy by the people of the country of great honor. These virgins who took care of their father's flock was sort of work. It was customary and very familiar for women in that time. They came first of all and drew water out of the well in a quantity sufficient for their flocks in their trough, where were made of the reception of the water. But when the shepherds came upon the maiden and drove them away, that they might have the command of the water themselves, Moses, thinking it would be a terrible reproach upon him if he overlooked the young women under unjust oppression and should suffer the violence of the men to prevail over the right of the Midian. And he drove them away, who had a mind to more than their share and afforded a proper assistance to the women. Chivalry is not dead in that day, I guess, who, when they had received such a benefit from him, came to their father and told him how they had been affronted by the shepherds and assisted by a stranger. And so in this particular vantage point, from this vantage point, they were assisted by a stranger and entreated. It didn't go into his look, where they said it, an Egyptian, and by his apparel and so forth. So they just say a stranger in this account, and entreated that he would not let this generous action be done in vain, nor go without a reward. Now the father took it well from his daughters that they were so desirous to reward their benefactor, and bid them bring Moses into his presence, that he might be rewarded as he deserves. So from this point of view, his vantage point, is saying it was the sisters that were kind of driving the conversation, if you will, and steering the father, and the father says, bring him to me, and so that we can reward him as he deserved. And when Moses came, he told him what testimony his daughters bear to him, that he had assisted them and that he was admired of him for his virtue. He said that Moses had bestowed such an assistant on persons not insensible of benefit, but they were both able and willing to return the kindness and even exceed the measure of his generosity. So he gave him his son. He made him his son and gave him one of his daughters in marriage, and appointed him to be the guardian and superintendent over his cattle, for of old all the wealth of the barbarians was in their cattle. So we see from the historian, we get that vantage point. He is known as a stranger. And so let's take a look now from the vantage point of the legend of the Jews, and it is entitled The Flight, and this is talking about Moses leaving. Same situation, guys, just different writers, different point of view, different vantage points, which we've always been talking about, which will give us a better picture. And we're going to then go into the book of Yasher and look from there, and then we'll circle back to the Bible and see what it says about this particular situation. So now, in the it is called The Flight in the Legend of the Jews. And an angel of God took Moses to a spot removed 40 days' journey from Egypt, so far off that all fear was banished from his mind. And I've done a study about this, guys, at my other podcast, and you guys should, and I just finished it, about mankind, our makeup. We are spirit, soul, and body, and I dealt with the mind. The mind consists of the thoughts. That's where our thoughts live. And so it is very interesting, because we see that as the angel took Moses to a spot 40 days journey from Egypt, so far off that all fear and banished from his mind. And emotion is one of the fearfulness is an emotion that it resides within the soul of the man. The soul consists of the thoughts, or the mind, the will, and the emotion. And the process is this. Let me give you guys a little tidbit. The process is that the thought will come into the mind. We then pick a thought, and we choose, and we decide in that will, we decide what we're going to do with this thought, if we're going to take it and meditate on it, And once we take it, once we say, yeah, I agree with this thought, it then receives an emotional stamp. And when it stamps it with that emotion, it is locked in, and it says that then it is deposited into the heart of mankind. So that is the process. If you guys want to know more about that, I suggest you go to Blueprint of Faith, is that podcast, and we deal with that. And I just finished that up. So anyway, so we see that fearfulness is banished from his mind. Indeed, his anxiety had never been for his own person, but only for an account of the future of Israel. So we see his anxiety was for the people. He had a servant heart, if you will, towards the children of Israel. And because God put that in there, because he is their deliverer, he doesn't know it yet, but it's in his heart. And we know that the children of Israel, one of them confessed. He says, "Who made you prince and judge over us?" And so we know that Moses becomes exactly that, basically. So anyway, so let's take a look again from this point of view and see what happens. So we see that he was concerned. It says the subrejection of his people had always been an unsolved enigma to him. Why should Israel, he would ask himself, suffer more than all the other nations? And I believe personally that God puts those questions into us, causes us to begin to question things, because he wants us to have a conversation. And he's going to answer a lot of these questions that are within Moses. As I mentioned to you, that the soul of mankind is a meditator. The soul meditates all day. We call it the subconscious mind in the world, if you will. The subconscious mind is meditating all day. It'll pick a thought and it will rehearse it all day long, and not knowing that we are programming ourselves to respond emotionally to a situation when it comes back up in our life. So that's what happens when we do that. And so we see then that he's concerned about the people of Israel. He is asking big questions. Why should our nation suffer over? But when his personal strait initiated him in the tale-bearing and backbiting that prevailed amongst the Israelites, then he asked himself, meaning what happened in verses 14 in chapter 2, when that type of attitude, when he began to think about it, he says, does these people deserve to be redeemed? And so the religious condition amongst the children of Israel were for such at that time as not to profit them to hope for divine assistance. So at this time, they're not ready yet. They didn't call yet. And we know that in the book of Exodus chapter 2, verses 23, it says it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Israel died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried. So that's when they were ready. They cried, and they cried for divine assistance. They refused to give ear to Aaron and the 5 sons of Zerah. So we see, again, they were not ready for that divine assistance. Who worked amongst them as prophets and admonished them unto the fear of God. It was not accounted an account of their impiety that the heavy hand of Pharaoh rested upon them more and more oppressively, until God had mercy upon them and sent Moses to deliver them from the slavery of Egypt. When he succeeded in effecting his escape from the hand of the hangman, Moses had no idea that a royal throne awaited him. It was nevertheless so. A war broke out at the time between Ethiopia and the nations of the east, and that had been subject to it until then. So we're seeing now, this is where we have the additional information. We see it here in the legend of the Jews, that he didn't go directly to Midian. He had some stuff happen in his life on his way to Midian. It was nevertheless, a war broke out between the Ethiopia and the nations of the east, that had been subject to it. So we know that Ethiopia was over them, it was ruling over them, and there was a rebellion, if you will. And so Kirkanos, the king of the Kushite, and we'll see that it's in the book of Yasher that this man is Cush, and he is the leader of the Kushite. And the king advanced against the army with a great army. He left Balaam, you remember Balaam, and his two sons, Janus and Jambres, behind to keep guard over his capital and take charge of the people remaining at home. And this guy, he's just absolutely one crooked man. Balaam is something else, and we'll see what he does. So Balaam sees an opportunity, and here we go. The absence of the king gave Balaam the opportunity of winning his subject over to his side, and he put upon the throne. His two sons were set over the army of his general. So Balaam took over as ruler. His sons are, he had two sons that he put as generals. To cut Kirkanos off from his capital, Balaam and his son invested the city so that none could enter it against their will. On two sides, they made the wall higher, and on the third, they dug a network of canals in which they conducted the rivers of the girding the whole land of Ethiopia, the Nile. That's what that is. And the fourth side, their magic art collected a large swarm of snakes and scorpions. Thus, none could depart and none could enter. You remember these guys? And their magic art collected a large swarm of snake. So this Balaam and this two sons, Janus and Jambres, again, remember that phrase and those two names. And their magic art collected a large swarm of snake and scorpions. Thus, none could depart and none could enter. Meantime, Kirkanos succeeded in subjecting the rebellious nation, and when he returned to the head of his victorious army, and he's coming back to his city now, he espied the high city wall from afar, and his men said, "The inhabitants of the city, seeing that war detained us abroad for a long time, have raised the walls and fortified them, that the king of Canaan may not be able to enter." On approaching the city gates, where they were barred, they cried out to the guards to open them. But by Balaam's instructions, they were not permitted to pass through. So they were surprised that they weren't going to be let in. They actually thought that because of that the people had fortified the city to keep the kings of Canaan out. But they realized that no, this is about them. On approaching the city gates, which were barred, they cried out to the guards to open them, but Balaam instructed them not to permit them to pass. A scrimmage ensued in which Kirkanos lost 130 men. On the morrow, the combat continued. So they fought one day, 140 people, 130 men died, and they continued the battle the next day. The king with his troops being stationed in the thither bank of the river, the day he lost his 30 riders who mounted on their steed and attempted to swim the stream. Then the king ordered a raft to be constructed for the transporting of his men. When the vessels reached the canal, they were submerged and the waters swirling around and round as though driven by a mill wheel swept away 200 men, 20 from each raft. So we see 200 men, 20 on a raft, and they perished. On the third day, they set about assaulting the city from side where the snakes and the scorpions swarm, but they failed to reach it, and the reptiles killed 170 men. The king desists from attacking the city, but the space of 9 years he surrounded it so that none could come out or go in. So 9 years after his conquest, he's besieging his city that was stolen from him by Balaam and his sons. While the siege was in progress, Moses appeared in the king's camp on his flight before Pharaoh. So, according to this, Moses is on the run. He sees this, he runs up on this camp, and at once he shows up, it tells us favor was on with Koranes and his whole army. He exercised attention upon all that he saw, for he was slender like a palm tree, his countenance shone like the morning sun, and his strength was equal to a lion. So we see then that Moses was he was a great fighter, a warrior. So deep was the king's affection for him that he appointed him to be commander in chief of his forces. And we know that Moses was already the general of the army of Egypt. So we know this boy is a fighter, and he had gotten victory before with his men. And so he shows up, but what was the ingredient that caused Kirkanos to look onto this young man? And you guys have heard me said it over and over and over again, found favor with God. And so favor, we've talked about that. Favor is divine influence upon the heart and the benefit that it brings to the believer. And you guys have heard me, we've been looking at these men's life, and we've seen that phrase over and over and over again about found favor in God's eye, found favor, and what the results were. And so at the end of 9 years, Kirkanos fell prey to a mortal disease. So he's out here, he's 9 years he's waiting, and he dies. And he died on the 70th day of his illness. So he got sick, and then 70 days within that illness, whatever that illness did, it was a mortal disease, killed him. His servants embalmed his body, buried him opposite the city gate towards the land of Egypt, and over his grave they erected a magnificent structure, strong and high upon the wall, wherefore they engraved all the mighty deeds and battles of the king. And we know that was a custom back then as well. Even, we see that in the Egyptian art when they find things and so forth. So now after the death of this king, his men were greatly grieved on account of the war. One said to another, "Counsel us, what shall we do at this time? We have been abiding in the wilderness away from our home for 9 years. If we fight against the city, many of us will fall dead. And if we remain here besieging it, we shall also die. For now all the princes of Aaron and the children of the east will hear that our king is dead, and they will attack us suddenly, and they will fight with us until not a remnant will be left. Now therefore let us go up and set a king over us, and we will remain here besieging the city until it surrenders unto us." And now this is the title of the next paragraph in the legend of the Jews. It is called the King of Ethiopia. They could find none except Moses, fit to be their king. They hastened and stripped off each man his upper garment, cast him into a heap upon the ground, making a high place, on top of which they sat Moses. So they created a nice little throne for him. And then they blew their trumpet and called out before him, "Long live the king, long live the king." And all the people and the nobles swore unto him to give him Adoniah for wife, the Ethiopian queen, the widow of Kirkanos. And they made Moses king over them on that day. They also issued a proclamation commanding every man to give Moses of what he possessed. And upon the high places they spread out a sheet, wherein each one cast something. This one a gold nose ring, the other a coin, onyx stone, beryllium, pearl, gold, silver, in a great abundance. So they give him a ton of stuff. And Moses was 27 years old when he became king over Ethiopia. And again, we're talking about this, and this is not mentioned in the Bible at all, but from these other sources, we see that here is this man, 27 years old, still a young man. Remember, he was 18 years old. He was a general in the Egyptian army. Now he's 27 years old, and he is made king over Ethiopia. And he reigned for 40 years. So here's this 27-year-old guy, and he now is reigned for 40 years. On the seventh day of his reign, all the people assembled and came before him to ask his counsel as to what was to be done about the city. How do we, what do we do? The king answered them and said, "If you will hearken to my words, the city will be delivered in your hand." Proclaim with a loud voice throughout the whole camp, all the people, saying, "Thus saith the king, go to the forest and fetch hither of the young of the stork, each man one fledging in his hand." So he's telling everybody, I want you to go into the forest and find you a young stork and bring him. And if there be any man that transgress the word of the king not to bring a bird, he shall die. So he's telling them, he set out this proclamation, this is a serious business. You go and you find something, and the king shall take all belonging to him. So he said, if you don't come back with this bird, I'm going to kill you and take all your stuff. And when he had brought them, they shall be in your keeping. You shall rear them up, and they will grow up, and you shall teach them to fly as the hawk flieth. So he is telling them, you guys get these things, and as they're now going to become familiar with them and be a part of their warfare later on, you'll see. So now let's continue. And all the people did according to the word of Moses. And after the young stork had grown up to full size, he ordered them to be starved for 3 days. So he gets these birds, everyone, so it must have been a ton of people there. And so all these birds are starving for 3 days. On the third day, the king said to them, let every man put on his armor, gird his sword upon each. Each one shall mount his horse, and each shall set his stork upon his hand, and we will rise up and fight against the city on the opposite side, the place where the serpents are. When they came to the appointed spot, the king said to them, let each man set forth his young stork to descend upon the serpents. Thus they did. So here these hungry storks start eating all these serpents. Remember that area that he and his son, through magic, if you remember, which we I made sure that I mentioned that to you guys, through magic had all these snakes and scorpions in that particular area when they were fortifying their city. So we saw about all the different walls, and it says so, and said on the fourth side of their magic arts collected a large swarms of snake and scorpions, and thus no one could depart. And so it's that side. Starved birds are now. He says, let man put on your armor and gird your sword upon each one of you shall mount his horse. And they went to the place where the serpents are. When they came to the appointed spot, the king said to them, let every man set forth his young stork to descend on the serpents. Thus they did. And the birds swooped down and devoured all the serpents and destroyed them. After the serpents were removed in this way, the men fought against the city, subdued it, and killed all its inhabitants. But of the people besieging it, they died not one. So we see then that he didn't lose any of his people, and they wiped out all those people that were in there. So now watch this man, again, Balaam. Balaam saw that the city had fallen into the hands of the besiegers. He exercised his magic arts, which enabled him to fly through the air, and he carried him with his his two sons, Janus and Jambres, and his 8 brothers, and they took refuge in Egypt. We're going to go back to those two guys in a minute. Seeing that they had been saved by the king and the city had been taken by his good counsel, the people became more than ever attached to him. They set the royal crown upon his head and gave him Adoniah, the widow of Kirkonos, to wife. But Moses feared the stern God of his fathers and went not unto Adoniah, nor did he turn his eyes towards her, for he remembered how Abraham had made his servants Eleazar swear, saying unto him, Thou shalt not take a wife for my son of the daughters of Canaan, amongst whom I dwell. He also remembered that Isaac did when Jacob fled before his brother Esau. Now he commanded his son, saying, Thou shalt not take a wife from the daughter of Canaan for thyself, and marry her, a marriage with any of the children of Ham. So we know that these guys were instructed not to marry a certain tribe because God had instructed that. And so because of some sin that happened within the family, Ham raped his mother, and Canaan was born. If you remember, Noah cursed Canaan from that union, and Canaan, it is believed that Ham was bragging because he raped his mother. He was taking his father's authority because his father was drunk, and that's what that was about, family issues. But anyway, so these two guys, and I want to talk to you about for a minute, Janus and Jambres. These two guys were mentioned by Paul, that these two men were the men that when Moses was before them and they threw their staff down and this became snakes, Moses' snake ate up these two guys. Snake, that's who these guys are. And so they play a big part in the deliverance of the children of Israel. These guys, remember, they made that snake pit, if you will, that area by magic. Their dad, by magic, were able them to fly through the air. So now let me talk to you guys about a couple of things before we shut it down here. Back in the day when the Nephilims, when the angels were here, the angels were here for several years reigning. The people call them the Anunnakis, the sky people. These were the 200 angels that came down and slept with the women, and they had children that were Nephilims, and these Nephilims began to criminalize the world, and they instituted vampirism, they slaughtered people, they began to eat people, cannibalism, all of these things they were practicing at that time. And God judged them and told them that they had 500 years, the original guys, and the Greek called those the Clash of the Titans, and they fought against each other actually, and they died, and the angels they were given, they would have to watch their children die actually. That was their punishment, and then they were separated. Azazel was put in a desert, rocks covering him, all kinds of stuff like that. But there were a couple of things that these guys did. The angels, the fallen angels, what they did, the rebellious one, they wrote in a cave how to create Nephilims and a bunch of stuff. And they found the Book of Giants, and the Book of Giants actually teaches people how to create Nephilims. One of the formula, if you will, to that. And now that book, Ham walked into a cave and he saw that, and he wrote that information down. There's another relic that was given to them, and that relic was the coat that God had given to Adam. Ham stole that from Noah, and gave that, and it went down to Nimrod. Nimrod wore it when he put it on. The scripture said he became a mighty man, and Esau killed him, cut his head off, and took that relic. There's another book also that was given to mankind, given to Noah, and that book was given to Shem, was a book of herbal medicine that had um, herbal treatment for every ailment that man had. It is also written in the book of Jubilees about that specific book. Now these relics have been, they're finding some of them. We haven't found the code. The Book of Giants again tells you some stuff in there. Now these arts, the reason I'm talking about it, these arts were passed down into the Egyptians, all of these magic stuff, because there was a book about spells and counter spells that the angels had written, the fallen angels, and those things went with that lineage, and that's why these guys were able to do much of what they had done back in that day. And so what we're going to do is close it out there, and I just want to thank you guys. We're going to pick it up again, but we see that this is on his way to Midian. And we didn't even get a chance to the book of Yasher, and we're going to do that next week, so we can look at the book of Yasher's depiction of what happened here as well. And he talks, in the book of Yasher, talks about this very same thing with Kirkanos and his wife and his Ethiopia and all that stuff. So, but I want to thank you guys for really following me, and I do apologize for the quality of this, because my computer died, and I'm doing this on my iPad. I'm going to try and get that in there tomorrow so they can fix it, but for right now I don't have one, and I'm doing this on my iPad. I actually downloaded a program to try it for the first time, so I'm trying this for the first time, so hang in there. Anyway, I just want to thank you guys. Subscribe, like, and share, so that people can get to know much that we do. And my goal is that we can learn who we are in Christ, so that we can become effective and change this world.